I am a human. Don't believe me? Watch this. I can't see anything, because it's dark, and I don't have dark vision. If you're new to D&D and just getting into creating your first character, then first of all, welcome. If you're anything like me, this is the start of a lifelong crippling addiction that will define your personality for decades. The two most important things to choose when making your first character are, of course, your class, which defines what your character does. I have a whole video about classes right somewhere, it's somewhere on the screen. But we don't care about class right now because we're worried about race. Race defines if you have pointy ears and are tall, or if you have pointy ears and are short, or if you don't have pointy ears at all. Unfortunately, there's more to each race than just the pointiness of their ears, so in this video we're going to break down every part of each of the races in the player's handbook. And hopefully by the time this video is over, you'll be ready to commit to one of these races for your character and then have them be your lifelong partner. Or, you know, just some character you play with in a one-shot and then make a million other characters, whichever you want to go with. The most important characteristics for each race are the 3 S's, or as I like to call them, those are size, speed, and specialty. Size is a category that just means how big your character is. It's most important in combat when you're taking up tiles on a battle map. Characters who are considered small take up 1 tile but can squeeze past bigger characters. Characters who are medium take up 1 tile and can't squeeze past, and then you have things like large and huge, which take up multiple tiles, but none of the races we're talking about today go to large or huge, so we're just worried about small and medium. Speed is also something that is mostly important in combat. It determines how many feet you can move per turn. But the most important part of each race is what I call their specialty. Each race comes with a few special attributes that differentiate them from the other races. Every race has what's called an ability score improvement, which adds a few points to one of the ability scores, those being strength, dexterity, charisma, constitution, intelligence, and wisdom. And then typically each race gets a few more special attributes that help them out in certain situations or make them more resilient in certain situations, but we'll get to each of those. The specialty is definitely what is going to have the biggest impact on your character, but I would highly recommend just picking whatever race sounds the coolest or looks the coolest to you. I wouldn't go for optimizing on your first character unless that's how you want to play. You'll have a lot better of a time at the table if you feel like you can connect with the character you've created, and race goes a long way to doing that. That sounds a little nerdy, but we are talking about D&D, so it gets pretty nerdy. Dwarves are short little buggers who have been around for quite a while because they can live up to 400 years, sometimes even more. In typical fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, which is a huge inspiration for D&D races, as you'll see as we go through all of them, dwarves are mountain people, usually like miners or warriors or any other rugged profession that they can possibly be. They're also known for talking like this. Oh God, I can't do a Scottish accent. This is probably a good time to say that there's a lot of things in the player's handbook and in other source material that tells you how a certain race acts, but you should feel completely free to ignore that. It's a useful jumping off point for making your character to know the typical behaviors of a race, but a race is made up of people, and people are different from one another. So if you want to make a dwarf who's not rugged and is more like a magic user druid who's really in tune with nature, go for it, dude. Freaking do it. It's a fantasy game. What's stopping you? But what is an objective truth about dwarves is that they're small, but they're not classified as small. Despite being short, dwarves are very stocky. They're very rounded out, and for that reason, D&D classifies them as medium, which means they're not going to be squeezing around other creatures on a battle map. Despite this, dwarves only get 25 feet of movement speed per turn, or 5 tiles. The average is 30 feet, but smaller characters usually get 25 because of their small legs. So dwarves, unfortunately, are not considered small and still get lower movement speed. So sorry guys, that's a tough draw for them. But now we get to the good stuff, the specialties. First of all, dwarves get dark vision, which means they can see up to 60 feet in dim light, and they can see in darkness as if it was dim light. So it's a really useful ability to have when dungeon delving, and it's one that luckily almost every single race has. Unfortunately, we as humans do not have that, even in D&D, but we'll get to it. As for their ability scores, dwarves get +2 to their constitution because, you know, they're so rugged and resilient, and this means they have things like more hit points and are able to stay concentrated on spells or are just less likely to be affected by poison. Actually, that brings me to the next special ability they have, Dwarven Resilience. Dwarven Resilience literally means they are less likely to be affected by poisons, and if they do take damage from poison, that damage is cut in half. So dwarves are really built around this idea that they are strong and resilient. But this is not where it ends with dwarves, because dwarves are one of a few races that have a sub-race that you need to pick when you make your character. The first sub-race is the Hill Dwarf, which is the less rugged version of a dwarf. They get a +1 to their wisdom score, and they get 1 hit point per level they level up, which can be pretty useful. The other subrace is the Mountain Dwarf, which is the much more stereotypical dwarf, the rugged, resilient, Lord of the Rings Gimli dwarf that you know from typical fantasy. These guys get a +2 to their strength score in addition to the +2 in their constitution they already got, so these people are ready to rumble in melee combat if that's the direction you want to take them. Overall, dwarves are cool. I think they're pretty neat, and I especially like to see stereotype breaking dwarves because dwarves get a lot of personality, and I think that's cool. This must be the 2023 Oscars Best Actor category, where they're announcing Austin Butler's movie in which he played the titular role, because we're talking about elves. Elvis. D&D elves, much like dwarves, are pretty close to the Tolkien-style elf. They're about the same size as humans, but they are described as being hauntingly beautiful. So feel free to make an ugly elf. The player's handbook also says that they like jewelry. So one of the defining characteristics of elves in D&D is that they live for a super long time, by far the most of any race. They can live as much as 700 years and sometimes more. They're not immortal, but they're pretty close to it relative to other races. What I like about that lifespan is it leaves a lot of room for creativity in your character's backstory. There's a lot of time for them to have had defining moments, or time to have learned combat styles or magic. It's just, it gives you a lot of creative freedom. Unsurprisingly, elves are classified as medium and can move 30 feet, and they also get dark vision. As you'll soon come to see, this is basically the standard package as far as those categories go. 30 feet movement, medium size, dark vision. Like so many races are that. Elves get quite a few specialties, but let's start with the ability score. Elves get a +2 to their dexterity score because they're so damn graceful. Dexterity helps you fight with finesse weapons like rapiers, and also helps you shoot things like bows and other ranged weapons. So basically, if you're trying to make a Legolas character, D&D has you covered. With elves, they're ready to shoot bows. Elves get something called keen senses, which just means they're really good at perception checks, and they also get Fey ancestry, which means they're less likely to be magically charmed, and they cannot be put to sleep by magic, which is a very dangerous condition to be put in, and also means you're gonna have way fewer turns in combat where you're not doing anything, so good for you, elves. And just like dwarves, we've got sub-races. The first is the High Elf, which is basically the hoity-toity, mightier-than-thou elf that you see in a lot of other fantasy. They're really, really intelligent, and almost every single member of the High Elf society has been trained in some form of magic. So even if you're a barbarian High Elf, which you totally can be, you're going to learn what's called a cantrip. Cantrips are spells that you can cast whenever you want without using any other resource than your action. It's a really useful thing to have in your back pocket no matter what you're playing, so it's cool that these guys get it. High Elves also get +1 to their intelligence score because, you know, they're so damn smart. Wood Elves have mastered the forests that they've grown up in and are able to move around them and hide within them with complete ease. Wood Elves get a +1 to their wisdom score and also get +5 feet of movement speed. So instead of moving 30 feet per turn, they can move 35 feet per turn, which is surprisingly useful. They're also able to stealth a little bit easier than other races, but stealth is a little bit of a confusing thing, and I could make an entire video just on that, so for now just know that they're able to stealth easier, and they get more movement speed, which is the cool part anyway. And finally we have the Drow. The Drow are elves that are from a place called the Underdark. The Underdark is known for being under, and also being dark. And also being very spooky. It's a really cool place, and if a campaign ever takes you there, be prepared, but it's also gonna be a lot of fun. Since the Drow are from the Underdark, they have darker skin typically, and they also get superior dark vision, which means they can see twice as far in darkness as any other race with dark vision. The Drow will also learn a cantrip at level 1, much like the High Elf, but will continue to learn cantrips as they level up, which is super cool. But there's a reason for this, and that's because the Drow are the only race with a debuff. They actually have a negative effect when they're in the sunlight. If you're a Drow in the sun trying to make an attack or do any sort of ability check that requires your sight, you're going to have disadvantage, which means you're much less likely to succeed at whatever you're doing. This seems bad, and I mean, like, it is, but it's also so cool to have this kind of flavor with a race. And again, no other race has something like this, and I'm a huge fan of it. And that's all there is to say about elves. If only there was some sort of elf that was not quite fully elf. Half-elf. Half-elves are human-elf hybrids. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, are there human hybrids of every other race? Nope. The player's handbook describes half-elves as being viewed as elves by humans and as humans by elves, which means they have a lot of times an identity crisis. And I think that's a really cool part of your backstory that you can incorporate, or you can ignore it altogether. Again, it's your story. Do what you want. Half-elves are also great for people who kind of want to be a human, but want a little bit of a fantasy edge to it. Boom, half-elves. They're basically the same size and traits as humans, but they have pointy ears and a bit of elven ancestry. Half-elves, of course, are classified as medium with 30 feet of movement speed, and you guessed it, dark vision. But they also get +2 to their charisma score and +1 to any 2 scores you want, which is really cool. They also share the Fey ancestry trait that I mentioned with elves just a little bit earlier on, and they can gain proficiency in any 2 skills of their choice. If you want to know what those skills are, look up a list of the skills. There's quite a few of them. Maybe I'll make a video about them someday. In my experience, half-elves are a fan favorite race. I think because they're the easiest race to relate to while still having a bit of a fantasy twist to them. And for that reason, it's not a bad starter pick if that's what you want to go with. Humans are, well, they're humans. There's a good chance that if you're watching this, you're a human. Unless you're showing this video to your cat, in which case, meow. Humans are, of course, medium and have, of course, 30 feet of movement speed, but humans do not have dark vision. I can't see in the dark, so that's actually just realistic. Good job. Good job, D&D. You did it. You made it realistic. I'll be honest, not having dark vision isn't the end of the world. You can just take a cantrip that casts light or grab a torch. The worst part of not having dark vision is actually just everyone else in your party who probably does have dark vision bullying you because you're blind. Humans are kind of the good at everything, master at nothing of D&D as far as races go, because instead of getting +2 to any ability score, they get +1 to every single ability score. This is pretty cool because that's 5 total points added to your ability scores, whereas other races just get 2 or 3. So it's pretty decent. But I'm pretty sure that's to compensate for the fact that the humans don't really do anything else. They're just kind of humans. I do want to add that if you're feeling iffy about playing a human because you're like, oh, I'm playing a fantasy game, why would I be a human? In my experience, humans are one of the rarest races that my characters play. Like, no one wants to be a human, so if you want to be a truly fantastical race, feel free to be a human. I've talked a lot about how much inspiration D&D took from Lord of the Rings, and that is no more evident than in the Halfling, because these guys used to be called hobbits, and then Tolkien, the Tolkien estate, was like, no, don't do that. When you read the player's handbook about halflings, they really are the silly little guys of D&D, but they don't have to just be that. However, if you're thinking about playing a silly little guy, a halfling might be a good pick for you. The player's handbook also describes them as appearing relatively harmless. For that reason, a halfling barbarian is really, really fun. Because of their short legs, halflings can only move 25 feet, much like the dwarf. But unlike the dwarf, they actually are considered small, so you can squeeze around your taller allies in combat, and it's great for that reason. I love that. Unfortunately, halflings don't get dark vision, but to compensate, they get +2 to their dexterity and one of the single best racial features in D&D, which is called lucky. Lucky means that whenever you do an attack roll or an ability check or a saving throw, if you roll a 1, you can re-roll the die and take the higher result. That basically means that whenever you're rolling a d20 as a halfling, if you roll a 1, it didn't happen. Roll it again. If you roll another 1, that's unfortunate, but I mean, this is just so good. It really makes these silly little guys so much more. But wait, there's more. There are sub-races for halflings, 2 to be exact. The first is the Lightfoot halfling, which is really the Bilbo Baggins of halflings. They are described as having a huge sense of wanderlust and use their charisma and stealthing abilities to traverse the world. For that reason, they get a +1 to their charisma score and are able to stealth behind any NPC or character that is larger than them. The second subrace is the Stout halfling, which has a lot more in common with dwarves in that they have that same poison resistance and they get a +1 to their constitution scores. Whichever you pick, you get lucky. Wait, no, that sounds wrong. While we're talking about silly little guys, let's move on to gnomes, who are definitely little, but definitely very smart and don't have to be silly. But the player's handbook does describe them as having an enthusiasm for living that is completely evident in everything they do. So that's neat. But I will say that if you have played Baldur's Gate 3, then you know that not all gnomes are these happy-go-lucky little people. Some of them are terrorists. Gnomes have the same small size and 25-foot movement speed as halflings, but they do get dark vision. And also to emphasize just how smart they are, they get a +2 to their intelligence score. Gnomes also get gnome cunning, which is something that just means they're less likely to be affected by wisdom, intelligence, or charisma-based magic. And as you may have guessed, there are 2 subraces with gnomes. The first of these is the forest gnome, which are gnomes that, you know, were raised in the forest. Forest gnomes get a +1 to their dexterity, I assume because they've been bobbing and weaving through the trees all their life, and they're also able to communicate with small beasts through the use of hand gestures and noises, which I'm pretty sure means that you can talk to a bird by just making bird calls and doing this, I'm pretty sure. Forest gnomes are also able to use the minor illusion cantrip, which can help distract enemies, and it basically just makes a mirage appear. Rock gnomes are the much more hardy and inventive type of gnome. They get a +1 to their constitution score and are also really good at tracing the history of magic items and other mysterious objects. Rock gnomes also get what's called the Tinker trait, which lets them use a set of tools called Tinker tools to make clockwork items. These clockwork items can be a clockwork toy that moves around and makes a little bit of noise, can be really useful to serve as a distraction. You can make a fire starter so you're able to light fires easier, or you can make a music box that plays a song. If you want, I guess. These 2 subraces are cool because they're very different from one another and have a lot of personality to them, so I think it's a cool thing to pick out when you decide to make your character if you go with gnome. But enough with the small people. Let's get back to big people, specifically the half-orc. The half-orc, along with the half-elf, are the only hybrid races in D&D 5th edition, but I will say there are more coming in a future edition. Half-orcs' appearances and behaviors vary wildly from half-orc to half-orc, and that's because they have that human ancestry and the orcish ancestry. If they grew up with orcs, then they're much more likely to be tribal and to be mired in scars, which are signs of honor in orcish tribes. But if they grew up in human society, they might be like any other human. They could be very intelligent librarians, or they could still be, you know, a little bit brutish from the underbelly of society. It all depends where they grew up. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with half-orcs. It's basically a clean palette for you to work with. You look really cool. You look like an orc, but you can talk like any other person. It's great. I love half-orcs. Half-orcs get the standard set of being medium, can move 30 feet, and of course have dark vision, but because of their generally larger size, they do get a +2 to their strength and a +1 to their constitution scores. In addition to that, half-orcs get what's called menacing, which makes them really good at intimidating people, which feels a little bit, you know, a little bit mean. They don't have to be so menacing. And they also get savage attacks, which just means you do even more damage on a critical hit than you already do. But by far my favorite part of half-orcs is their relentless endurance. Relentless endurance just means that once per day, when your hit points drops to 0, when you would normally fall unconscious, you can actually fall to 1 hit point instead. It's really useful for getting an extra action in combat before you go unconscious, or healing so you can avoid it entirely, and it can be really a make or break in a lot of situations. So with menacing savage attacks and relentless endurance, it really drives home just how badass half-orcs are. I'm a huge fan. But if we're going to talk about races that I'm truly a huge fan of, we're going to talk about my favorite race, the Tiefling. You might be wondering why they're my favorite race. Is it because they have a lot of special features or some crazy high movement speed or anything? No, they're pretty average. It's because they look so damn cool. They've got horns. Tieflings are humanoids with an infernal bloodline, which basically you can see as being human demon hybrids. This means they can have skin colors ranging from deep purple to a bright red to blue even. They get the cool horns, and you can make the horns look however you want. You can have them curl, or you can have them be like small, or you can have them be broken off. Like, what happened? Why is your horn broken? Tieflings are also one of the only races that doesn't have a homeland. They tend to live among humans and can be in whatever part of society with humans, but in D&D lore, they're typically relegated to the fringes of society because of how they look. That might not be true in your world or in your DM's world, but in D&D lore, that is how they're treated. Because of this though, they have learned how to subsist basically on their personalities and their smarts. For this reason, they get +2 to their charisma score and +1 to their intelligence score. Tieflings get the standard set, medium size, 30 feet movement speed, and dark vision, but the racial features they get is what really makes them feel like they're from an infernal hell. The first thing they get is called hellish resistance, which means they take half damage from fire damage, which just makes sense if you're supposed to be from the underworld. Tieflings also get something called Infernal Legacy, which lets them cast Thaumaturgy as a cantrip. Thaumaturgy is awesome. It lets you have a bunch of magical effects happen. You can make your eyes glow when you're talking to someone, or make your voice boom 3 times louder, or make flames rise or change color. It can really help add to the atmosphere of an interaction you're having with an NPC if you're really trying to like intimidate them or convince them that there's like a poltergeist going on. It leaves a lot of room for RP. I love it. Infernal Legacy will give you more cantrips as you level up, but at level 1, you get Thaumaturgy, and that's what we're going to focus on for now. I think Tieflings just have so much room for creativity because of their backstory, at least in the classic D&D lore, but also, they just look so cool. So if you play a Tiefling, you have my support. And last but certainly not least, we have the most exotic of the D&D races, the Dragonborn. If you've played Skyrim, then this is not that Dragonborn. This is a different Dragonborn entirely. These Dragonborn are dragon humanoid hybrids. They basically look like dragons who are walking on their hind legs. They're also generally taller and heavier than humans, so they can be pretty damn imposing. Because of this imposing size, Dragonborn get a +2 to their strength score, but they also get a +1 to their charisma score. I assume because they can be pretty intimidating, which is a charisma skill. They do get the standard set of 30 feet movement and medium size, but they don't get dark vision, which I think is weird, but I guess they didn't want to make humans the only race with no dark vision. The coolest part about Dragonborn is, unlike other races where you don't choose a subrace or there's only a couple of subraces to choose from, with Dragonborn, you choose what kind of dragon you're descended from. There are 10 different dragons to choose from, and they have different attributes based on what you choose. Your draconic ancestry will change 2 things. The first being your breath weapon. Every Dragonborn gets a breath weapon. If you choose to be descended from a red dragon, for example, you'll spew out fire damage like a very stereotypical dragon. But if you choose to be descended from a white dragon, you'll spit out this icy breath that does cold damage. And on the other side of that coin, your draconic ancestry grants you resistance to that damage. So red dragons are resistant to fire damage, white resistance to cold. There's a whole table in the player's handbook that defines all this and also tells you exactly the size of your breath weapon. Dragonborn, in my opinion, are easily the most unique of all the races in the player's handbook. I mean, they're the only one that doesn't look strictly humanoid in some way. For that reason, they're also the one I've seen played the least. I think because you kind of want to be able to relate to your character a little bit, and it could be maybe a little hard to relate to like a lizard person, but if you're trying to play something that's out there and really cool and extremely customizable, I think Dragonborn are a good pick. My light just turned off. Well, that's probably a sign that I've talked for too long, but that is all the races in D&D. Which one is your favorite? Which one are you gonna play? If you're like me, you'll just start making characters and eventually have made a character for each of them. But I'm gonna go to sleep now.